There is a moment, a specific, measurable, physics-defined moment, when everything that defines modern civilization stops. Not gradually, not with warning, not with the slow decay of systems you might have time to adapt to. It stops in a fraction of a second, in approximately 1 nanosecond to 1 microsecond, depending on the source and distance. Every semiconductor device within hundreds of miles receives a pulse of electromagnetic energy so intense, so brutally efficient at destroying the microscopic architecture of integrated circuits that the infrastructure humanity has spent a century building simply ceases to function. Power grids go dark. Vehicles with electronic ignition systems stall mid-highway. Hospitals lose not just grid power, but backup generator controls. Water treatment facilities, which depend on programmable logic controllers to manage pumping, filtration, and chemical dosing, go offline. Communication networks collapse simultaneously. The digital financial system, which processes trillions of dollars in transactions every hour, becomes inaccessible not because the money is gone, but because the machines that track it no longer operate. And all of this happens before a single human being has time to react, before a single alarm sounds, before a single emergency broadcast reaches anyone, because the broadcast infrastructure itself is among the first casualties. This is not a theoretical scenario designed to sell emergency preparedness products. This is a physical reality that has been studied, modeled, tested, and documented by some of the most rigorous scientific and military research institutions on the planet. The physics of electromagnetic pulse events, whether they originate from a nuclear detonation at high altitude, a massive solar coronal mass ejection, or a purpose-built non-nuclear EMP device, are well understood. The vulnerability of modern technological infrastructure to such events is not a matter of debate among engineers and physicists who have examined the evidence. What is a matter of debate, and what has been the subject of disturbing institutional inertia for decades, is why the knowledge required to survive such an event, knowledge that is grounded in real science and real engineering, remains so poorly distributed among the general population. The purpose of what you are about to hear is not to frighten you. Fear without direction is useless. The purpose is to give you the analytical framework, the scientific understanding, and the practical engineering knowledge that allows a prepared individual to survive and function in the aftermath of an electromagnetic pulse event. That framework begins not with a list of supplies to buy or a checklist of actions to perform. It begins with understanding the physics, because without understanding the physics, every preparation you make will have critical gaps that will be discovered at the worst possible moment. To understand the threat, you must first understand what an electromagnetic pulse actually is at the physical level. An electromagnetic pulse is a burst of electromagnetic energy that spans an extremely wide range of frequencies simultaneously. Unlike radio waves, which are engineered to operate on a specific frequency, an EMP event produces energy across what engineers call a broadband spectrum, from extremely low frequencies in the range of a few hertz all the way up to gigahertz frequencies. This broadband characteristic is precisely what makes it so devastating. Every electronic circuit, every antenna, every conductor of any length acts as a receiver tuned to some portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. When energy arrives simultaneously across the entire spectrum at intensities that can be many orders of magnitude above anything those circuits were designed to handle, the result is catastrophic and simultaneous failure across all electronic systems, regardless of their design purpose. The energy arrives in what physicists and engineers categorize as 3 distinct components when describing a nuclear-generated EMP. And understanding these 3 components is foundational to understanding both the damage mechanisms and the protective strategies. The first component, designated E1, is the fastest and in many ways the most destructive component for electronics. It is generated when the gamma rays from a nuclear detonation interact with air molecules at high altitude, stripping electrons from those molecules in a process called Compton scattering. These freed electrons, moving at relativistic speeds, interact with Earth's magnetic field and are deflected downward toward the surface in a process that generates an extraordinarily intense electromagnetic pulse. The E1 component rises in intensity in approximately 1 nanosecond and reaches peak intensity within a few tens of nanoseconds before decaying. The electric field strength of an E1 pulse from a high-altitude nuclear detonation can reach 50,000 volts per meter at the surface. To put that in engineering terms, a 1-meter length of wire lying on the ground during an E1 event could have 50,000 volts induced across it. The voltage ratings of the electronic components connected to that wire are measured in units, tens, or at most hundreds of volts. The result is immediate, catastrophic, and irreversible destruction of those components. The second component, designated E2, is slower, lasting from approximately 1 microsecond to 1 second after the initial detonation. It is generated by scattered gamma rays and neutrons interacting with lower layers of the atmosphere. In isolation, E2 would be manageable. Its characteristics are similar to those of a lightning strike. An infrastructure that is designed and built with lightning protection can often survive E2. However, E2 does not arrive in isolation. It arrives immediately after E1, at a moment when the lightning protection systems and surge suppressors that might have handled E2 have already been destroyed or compromised by the far more intense E1 component. This sequential nature of EMP components is a critical and frequently misunderstood aspect of the threat. The third component, designated E3, is the slowest, lasting from tens of seconds to hundreds of seconds. It is generated by the distortion and recovery of Earth's magnetic field following the nuclear detonation and has characteristics similar to a severe geomagnetic storm caused by solar activity. E3 is particularly dangerous to long conductors, power transmission lines, pipelines, and undersea cables. It induces slow, powerful currents called geomagnetically induced currents, or GICs, that can saturate and burn out the large power transformers that form the backbone of electrical grid infrastructure. These transformers, some of which weigh hundreds of tons and require highly specialized manufacturing processes, cannot be quickly replaced. The global supply chain for these transformers means that replacing a significant number of them following an EMP event could take years, not months.
Now, the solar electromagnetic thread operates somewhat differently from the nuclear EMP model, but produces overlapping effects at the infrastructure level, particularly through its own version of E3-like geomagnetically induced currents. A coronal mass ejection, or CME, is a massive eruption of plasma and magnetic field from the sun's corona. When a CME of sufficient magnitude reaches Earth, it compresses Earth's magnetosphere and drives intense geomagnetic storm conditions. The Carrington event of 1859, the most powerful geomagnetic storm in recorded history, induced such powerful currents in the telegraph networks of the time that telegraph systems operated without battery power from the induced current alone, and some telegraph stations caught fire. If an equivalent event occurred today, the effect on a grid infrastructure that is incomparably more complex, interconnected, and dependent on precision electronic control systems would be catastrophic on a scale that is difficult to overstate.
The 1989 Quebec blackout, caused by a geomagnetic storm that was modest by Carrington scale standards, collapsed the entire Hydro-Quebec power grid in 90 seconds, leaving 6 million people without electricity for up to 9 hours, and caused damage to transformers across North America that took months to fully address. That event had a geomagnetic disturbance rating of approximately K9 on the planetary K-index scale. The Carrington event is estimated to have been at least K9 and possibly significantly stronger. Solar physicists studying ice core records of cosmogenic isotopes have identified evidence of solar proton events in 774 to 775 AD and 993 to 994 AD that appear to have been 10 to 20 times more energetic than the Carrington event. The Sun is capable of producing events that dwarf anything in the modern instrumental record. What this means practically is that the EMP threat is not a single narrow scenario with a single narrow cause. It is a threat category with multiple sources, each with different characteristics, different warning times, and different survival strategies that partially overlap and partially diverge. A high-altitude nuclear EMP provides essentially zero warning, as the detonation itself is the warning, and the pulse arrives at the speed of light. A solar CME, of the type that produces significant geomagnetic effects, can be detected when it leaves the Sun by instruments monitoring solar activity. But the transit time from Sun to Earth is typically 1 to 3 days, and the ability to predict the orientation of the magnetic field embedded in the CME, which determines how severe the geomagnetic storm will be, remains limited until the CME is only about 30 to 60 minutes from Earth. That 30 to 60 minute window is essentially the real warning time for a severe geomagnetic event, and it is profoundly insufficient for any organized grid protection response, given the complexity of the actions required. Here is where the first critical misunderstanding about EMP survival enters the picture, and it is one that shapes every subsequent decision about preparation. Most people who have thought about the EMP threat at any level conceive of it primarily as a threat to electronics, and they therefore conceive of the primary survival challenge as replacing or protecting electronic devices. Buy a Faraday cage, store a spare radio, keep an older vehicle that doesn't have electronic ignition. These are reasonable starting points, but they represent a profound underestimation of the actual survival challenge because they focus on the mechanism of initial disruption rather than the cascade of infrastructure failures that follows. The loss of electronics is not the survival crisis. The loss of electronics is the triggering event that initiates the real survival crisis, which unfolds over days, weeks, and months through the collapse of every system that modern human survival depends upon. Consider water. In the United States and virtually every developed nation, the water that reaches residential taps travels through a system of extraordinary complexity. It is pumped from sources through treatment facilities, where it is filtered and chemically treated, pumped through pressurized distribution networks to elevated storage tanks or towers, where gravity provides the distribution pressure, and then distributed through miles of pipes to end users. Every stage of this process requires electrical power and electronic control. The pumps require power, the chemical dosing systems require power and electronic control, the pressure monitoring and valve control systems require electronic controllers. In an EMP event, all of this stops. In major urban areas, the residual pressure in distribution pipes typically maintains water flow at tops for a period of hours to perhaps a day or two, depending on local conditions, after which the pressure drops and flow stops. The water in elevated tanks drains by gravity until depleted. After that, unless generators with functioning electronic controls are operational and have fuel, there is no running water. The implications of losing running water are not fully appreciated by most people who have not experienced it for extended periods. Human beings require approximately 2 liters of drinking water per day at minimum for survival, more in hot conditions or during physical exertion. Beyond survival hydration, water is required for sanitation. The cessation of flushing toilets and hand-washing water in a dense urban environment creates conditions for the rapid spread of cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, and a range of other waterborne diseases that were the primary killers of human beings for most of recorded history, and that remain devastating in populations without immunity or medical infrastructure. Within a few days of water system failure in a major urban area, the sanitation crisis begins. Within a few weeks, without intervention, the disease crisis becomes severe, and the medical infrastructure that would normally respond to such a crisis is itself offline, because hospitals depend on the same electronic systems and the same power grid as everything else.
This cascade logic is the fundamental structure of the EMP survival challenge, and it must be understood in its full depth before any meaningful preparation can be designed. The threat is not simply that your phone stops working. The threat is that water stops flowing, food distribution stops, medical care becomes unavailable, heating and cooling systems fail in weather conditions that kill without them, sanitation breaks down, and all of these failures occur simultaneously across an entire geographic region, potentially across an entire continent, with no functioning communication system to coordinate any response. The people who survive the first 48 hours without significant injury face a survival environment that will deteriorate for months before any organized recovery begins, and that recovery will be severely hampered by the simultaneous loss of the electronic infrastructure that modern industrial production depends upon.
There is a specific principle in emergency management called the principle of cascading failures, and it is well documented in the academic literature on infrastructure resilience. A cascading failure occurs when the failure of one system creates conditions that cause the failure of adjacent or dependent systems, which in turn cause further failures in a self-amplifying chain. Normal infrastructure is designed with redundancy and fail-safes to interrupt such cascades at early stages. An EMP event is specifically devastating because it attacks all systems simultaneously, bypassing the normal points where cascade propagation would be interrupted. Every backup system, every redundant communication pathway, every emergency response network fails at the same moment as the primary system it was designed to back up.
The emergency management literature contains a useful concept called the resilience curve, which describes the trajectory of a system or community following a disruptive event. Normally, a community experiences disruption, begins a recovery process, and over time returns to something approaching normal function. The key variables are the depth of the initial disruption, how far below normal function the community falls, and the speed of recovery. EMP events are projected to push the resilience curve deeper than almost any other disaster category because the disruption affects not just one system but all systems simultaneously, and because recovery is hindered by the same infrastructure failure that caused the disruption. You cannot repair the electronic control systems of a power plant without power. You cannot manufacture replacement electronic components without functioning factories. You cannot transport repair equipment and personnel without functioning logistics networks. The depth of the disruption and the difficulty of recovery are correlated and mutually reinforcing in a way that is unique to the EMP threat category. This is the landscape you must be prepared to navigate, not the dramatic, cinematic moment of the pulse itself, which will likely be imperceptible to human senses, but the slow, grinding, increasingly desperate weeks and months that follow as the cascading failures reach their full depth and the survival calculus becomes brutally clear. Who prepared? Who understood the threat in sufficient depth to prepare for the real challenges rather than the superficial ones? Who built the knowledge, skills, physical infrastructure, and social networks required to survive not the event itself, but its aftermath? The preparation framework begins with what survival instructors and military strategists alike called the terrain analysis, which in this context means a rigorous assessment of your specific geographic, infrastructural, and social environment. This is not a generic analysis. The EMP survival calculus is radically different for a person living in a rural area with a private well, a wood stove, a root cellar, and 20 miles of low population density land between themselves and the nearest urban center,
versus a person living in a 42nd floor apartment in a major city with no independent water source, no heating alternative, no food storage, and millions of neighbors in similar situations. Both individuals face the same pulse, but the nature of their survival challenge is entirely different, and the preparation required is entirely different.
The urban scenario is, to speak plainly, the most dangerous EMP scenario for civilian survival. The concentration of population in urban areas is a product of the efficiency of modern supply chains and infrastructure systems. Those systems deliver food, water, energy, and other survival necessities to populations that could not sustain themselves independently from local resources. When those systems fail simultaneously and permanently rather than temporarily, the arithmetic of survival in dense urban areas becomes devastating. The city of New York, for example, has a population of approximately 8 million people within city limits and 20 million in the greater metropolitan area. The agricultural land within a reasonable travel distance of the city could not feed anything close to that population. The aquifers and surface water sources accessible without a functioning distribution system are insufficient for that population. In an extended grid-down scenario following an EMP event, the survival challenge for people in that environment is not a matter of clever preparation and resourcefulness. The numbers do not work. This is a scientific and logistical statement, not a political one.
The practical implication of this analysis for urban dwellers is not to give up on preparation, but to understand that the most critical preparation for someone in a dense urban environment may be preparation for rapid, organized relocation rather than extended shelter in place. This creates its own set of challenges that we will examine in depth, including the challenge of mobility in a vehicle-dependent society when vehicles may not function, the challenge of navigation without GPS, the challenge of passing through areas with other population centers, and the challenge of reaching a destination that is itself prepared to receive additional people. All of these challenges have solutions rooted in real science and real planning, but they require advanced thought and preparation that most people have never undertaken.
The question of vehicle functionality in an EMP event is one of the most widely misunderstood aspects of EMP preparedness, and the misunderstanding cuts in both directions. Some people believe that all vehicles will be immediately and permanently disabled. Others believe that the threat to vehicles is minimal because the steel body of a vehicle provides shielding. The truth, as revealed by actual EMP testing conducted by the U.S. EMP Commission and summarized in their 2004 and 2008 reports, is significantly more nuanced. The EMP Commission conducted tests on a range of vehicles to assess their vulnerability to EMP. The results showed that most modern vehicles did not immediately and permanently stop functioning when exposed to EMP fields at the levels tested. Many vehicles experienced temporary malfunctions, including stalling and control system disruptions, but were able to be restarted and driven after the exposure. However, the test conditions were not identical to a worst-case HEMP scenario. The vehicles tested were not exposed to the full range of field strengths that could occur in such an event, and the testing acknowledged that higher field strengths would produce more severe and permanent damage.
What this means practically is that the vehicle picture is complicated. Newer vehicles with more extensive electronic systems and more electronic dependence are generally more vulnerable than older vehicles with simpler electronics. Diesel engines, which do not require electronic ignition systems in the same way gasoline engines do, may be less vulnerable in some respects. Vehicles with electronic fuel injection systems are more vulnerable than vehicles with carbureted engines. Vehicles that are exposed to the pulse while running may be more vulnerable than vehicles that are parked and not running, because a running vehicle has more systems actively powered and therefore more potential for immediate disruption.
None of this is certain, and the variability of outcomes in actual EMP testing underscores the importance of not relying on any single technology or system for survival mobility. The truly important insight from the vehicle analysis is not about individual vehicles, but about the transportation network as a whole. Even if many vehicles survive the initial pulse with recoverable malfunctions, the transportation network fails for reasons that go beyond individual vehicle functionality. Traffic signals, which are electronic, fail. Electronic toll systems fail. Fuel distribution networks, which depend on electronic payment systems and electronic pump controls, stop functioning. Navigation systems go offline. Emergency road service and traffic management systems go offline. The infrastructure of modern automotive transportation collapses, even if many of the vehicles themselves could theoretically operate. And the roads, particularly in and around urban areas, fill with vehicles that have stalled or that are driven by panicking people who have no plan and no idea what is happening. The practical mobility environment in the hours and days following an EMP event in any area of significant population density becomes increasingly gridlocked and dangerous.
The survival implications of this transportation reality drive one of the most important and underemphasized principles of EMP preparedness: physical fitness and mobility independence. The ability to move on foot, carrying necessary supplies over distances of tens to potentially hundreds of miles across terrain that may not follow roads, is a fundamental survival capability in this scenario. This is not about extreme athletic performance. It is about basic human physical capacity to move through the environment without dependence on technology. The average adult in reasonably good physical condition can walk approximately 20 to 25 miles per day on established paths, carrying a moderate load. That is a finite and manageable capability if the destination and route are known in advance and if the necessary supplies and equipment are prepared and available. The principles of backpacking and wilderness travel, which represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about human-powered movement through challenging environments, become directly survival relevant in this context. The weight of a carried load, measured against the distance to be traveled and the caloric expenditure required, is a critical optimization problem. The selection of footwear, which must provide both comfort over long distances and durability on varied terrain, is a critical decision that most people have never been forced to make. The navigation skills required to move across unfamiliar terrain without GPS or functional maps, using terrain features, celestial navigation, and compass-based dead reckoning, are skills that were once common in human populations and that have been almost entirely displaced by electronic navigation technology. These skills must be relearned and practiced because in an EMP event, they become survival critical.